Hi, today I'm going to be talking about The Crippled God, the second half of the book. If you want to hear my thoughts on chapters 1 through 16, then please check out my mid-book chat. I'll link it in the cards. I don't even know what to say, how to summarize my feelings about this book. I think the word sublime is just the best word choice for this book. I know that's one that Philip Chase uses, but it's one that I definitely see applying here. I think there is so much to say, but overall, I am very satisfied with how this book ended. And when I got to the midpoint, there are a few things I'll say. One is that I thought for sure that everyone was going to die. In fact, I knew the word fallen, Malazan Book of the Fallen, that word, you might suspect what that means earlier on when you read in the series. But when I got to the midpoint of this book, that word had a certain weight to it that I hadn't expected, that I hadn't felt up until that point quite to that extent. And the word fallen is used throughout the book in various ways. It sort of seems to have a connotation with failure or death. But yeah, I really thought everyone was going to die. I thought this was a mission where everyone was going to die. I think even the characters thought they were all going to die on this mission. And it was starting to really get to me. Another thing I want to say about this book before I move on, though, into some of the spoilers and thoughts there is that, well, of course, I'm not going to talk about everything that happens in this book. I never will with a Malazan Book of the Fallen discussion. These are just going to be some of the highlights as I saw them. And I'm sure once I finish filming, I'll remember a ton more that I wish I had said. But I'm going to do the best I can to make this discussion flow in a meaningful way. And one thing I'll also say about the series in general is one thing that I've really enjoyed is how unique each book is. And I really enjoy Erikson's very unique approach to structure as well. And this book was no exception, even though it's an extension of Dust of Dreams in many ways. It was interesting to see that this particular book wasn't divided into 4 sections or 4 books, as many of the previous books. It's actually divided into 7 sections with 2 epilogues. So I really enjoyed that, though. I thought it was paced incredibly well, too. I found myself reading on, even though I would think I would stop at a certain point before I knew it. I was reading on to the next section and the next section. I felt like so much momentum in this book to find out what's going to happen next. And at the same time, feeling that sense of dread, again, with the word fallen. But just to sort of go over a summary as best I can, I'm probably going to go out of order a bit as I talk about these points, but I'll start a little bit in order with chapter 17. And that's the chapter with Badal and the snake intersecting with the Malazans. First of all, when it comes to the snake, when I read about them in Dust of Dreams, I wasn't really sure who the snake were. I mean, I got the impression these are children, but I still felt a little confused, especially because it's called the snake in the Dramatis Personae. And I thought, okay, is this a new race of people? What do they mean by the snake? And it was just very interesting to see that by snake, we're talking about thousands of children, kind of information in what must look like a snake from a child's perspective. And I love that. I absolutely loved that. I know there's more to them as well, as we could tell with Badal's magic and her amazing ability with words. There's a lot to these characters, but I just found that fascinating. It just sort of grounded them too once they intersected with the Malazans. And the Malazans, their response to seeing these starved children, it was incredible. And of course, we see that Blistig is kind of falling apart throughout this book. It's just very tragic to see the way he's sort of spiraling. It's clear that he had some mistrust issues with Tavor for a while, but they really come to the forefront in this book. And he brings up the very utilitarian argument, which is we don't have enough water for these kids. We don't have enough food. We could barely manage on our own. Many of us are dying. We're having to kill horses. What are we doing taking on these children who are already near death? It just doesn't make sense, logical sense, to take on this responsibility. And Tavor, she steps forward and she defies his sense in that and basically takes on responsibility for these children. And it's very devastating to see how these children come along, and they obviously have an effect on the soldiers. many of them die and curl up and die near them. It has a softening effect, I think, on many of the people and many of the soldiers. And I also think that it's worth noting that a lot of the children, as much as they were grateful for whatever food or water the Malazans were able to offer them, they were all the more grateful just to be acknowledged. And another thing to mention about this particular chapter, especially when I looked back in my notes on it, there were a couple of things that came to mind or that came to my awareness that I just thought I'd share. And I don't know if they're meaning what I think they're meaning, but I just found it really interesting that there was a part in which I think it was Rut, if I have the name of the kid right. I get their names a little mixed up here and there, but one of them said to Badal, "I want to be blind again, Badal." And I was wondering if that was almost like an echo back to a passage that Knuckles had about an artist tearing out his eyes in order not to take in any more suffering. So I wondered about that, but this idea of being blind again, it also seemed to me almost to tie into this idea of being witnessed or unwitnessed. And this is obviously a huge theme in these books, this idea of being witnessed or unwitnessed. And I really found it meaningful in that chapter when we have Fiddler who's reflecting on this passage. And I won't read too many quotes, I promise, but there's this one passage in which Fiddler is thinking, what if your journey belongs to you and you alone? No destination, no reason or purpose. What if tomorrow or the next day you finally descend to wipe out all of us, to make pointless our every struggle, our every great noble cause? What is it then, O glorious universe, that you are willing to tell us? Destiny is a lie. It really made me wonder, in this case, does destiny require a witness? Is this idea of a noble cause, is it reliant upon feeling a sense of something greater than ourselves, witnessing what we do in order to acknowledge or validate that it is the right thing to do? And I find this interesting in contrast to what I was talking about in that last video on the Crippled God, where I talked about this theme of righteousness coming up with Tanakalian and with the Vorkrul Assail, which, by the way, I thought it was really interesting that those two forces joined forces, given that I made that connection between those two in that theme in the first half of the book. But I found it really interesting, though, that Fiddler brings this question up. And I know when I say witnessed by something higher or bigger, it's almost like thinking of God in a more biblical sense. And I know gods in this particular book are very different than that kind of God. There's more interaction between mortals and gods it's much more complicated. It does bring up these questions about good deeds, about a noble cause, and whether that can be acknowledged without anyone to recognize it. And I think this comes through in other places in this book. And I think Tavor talks about this, how history is not going to remember them. This is all going to be passed on and lost in history. And even if at the end of the day, they did not go totally unwitnessed, as Bryce pointed out, and I'm sorry if it's Brees, if I get that name right, or Briss. I've heard it so many different pronunciations, so please let me know if you have the correct one in the comments below. But he talks about that too at the end with Tavor, about how they have been witnessed after all. And Tavor basically shrugs. I'm going to talk more about Tavor, of course, but I found that really interesting how she kind of just shrugs, and he tells her that he's going to make a bronze statue to remember her. And she asks, will it be beautiful? And I think she's just being kind of sarcastic in that moment, but she walks away before he says, yes, of course. And so anyway, back to chapter 17. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. I'll be jumping all over the place probably in this discussion. But I did find it interesting just to think about this theme of being witnessed and this idea of being blind. And by the way, I think it kind of comes up a little bit in the epigraph of chapter 17. Well, I noticed the line in the epigraph there, the faces all in rows will wait. So that line stuck out to me, and I couldn't help but think of the snake children. And then through your eyes, who waits for me? So again, I just kind of feel like it kind of speaks to me about this theme of being witnessed and what that means. And then another theme that sort of comes up in this chapter, of course, related to children, is innocence. And nothing more heartbreaking, in my opinion. Honestly, I got so heartbroken over the toys scene. If you've read this book, you know what I'm talking about. There's that line, it wasn't fair, of all the crimes that he had seen in his life, almost too long to comprehend, this one surpasses them all. The look on her face, on the boys, when she told him that pathetic collection carried like a treasure. And is it not a treasure? Finally, he wiped a hand before his eyes and said, we spoke of murdering gods with a strange diffidence, almost a bluster. And what do they show us? Adjunct. What are we when we murder innocents? And to me, it seems almost as though innocence is connected to something worth valuing, just the act alone of valuing these pathetic treasures, these toys, and seeing that they are just objects, that they're not really of value, but to the child, they are valuable. And the act of just being able to do that, to value something, is kind of, I think, connected to innocence and connected to something worthy and something that would be heartbreaking to murder innocence. There's a lot of talk too about truth having claws and keeping the truth, sort of, that the truth isn't something just to be thrown out there. I think that's something I'm kind of gathering from this book. Like I said, there is a line, I think, where truth has claws, and there's also a part related to that with Badal, and Badal telling Tavor that she has words for her, she has a poem for her. Around that same area of the book, there's a passage with Hood and Shirk in which Hood tells Shirk that he saw Tavor through Felison's eyes when Felison died, that Tavor didn't know she killed her sister. He says Tavor killed her sister and is driven by guilt, even though she doesn't know. Even though she doesn't know that she killed her sister, there's still a guilt there. And to me, that almost speaks to the universality of killing someone who isn't your sister, but could be someone's sister. It could be anybody's sister, and that matters. And not knowing, again, this theme of not knowing was a mercy to Tavor. It also made me wonder if possibly the words that Badal had for Tavor that she later forgets, the poem that she forgets, I wondered if that had to do with Felison. And maybe, again, it's a mercy that those claws of truth don't tug at Tavor, who's already going through so much in this book. So that came to my mind. I don't know if that's the case. It was just a theory I had. And it's also worth noting that Hood says that Tavor brings out humility in the gods and takes away their arrogance, but they offer no reward in return. So it's just a lot to contemplate. It's just a powerful chapter in so many different ways. So a couple of other things worth mentioning. I really enjoyed the exchange between Ublala Pung and Draconis. Right before Draconis leaves Ublala, I wasn't sure what to think of Ublala for a long time. And I thought it was very ironic that Ublala made a fuss over children and how he didn't like babies, but he is kind of like a big baby. But it's really interesting to see Draconis, who's this very dark figure, hug Ublala right before he leaves and says basically that his friendship gives him faith in what he's about to do and what he's about to attempt to do. And I just thought that was so bittersweet. It was a bittersweet ending there. Now, about Sandalaf, I have to say that that whole mad scene was very tragic. Of course, it was so sad when she thought Nimander was Animander. And it was interesting the way the Ghost of Fade got involved in that and sort of helped out with that situation, especially given some of the events in Reaper's Gale. So interesting storyline there. And it's really strange because before reading this book, not long before reading this book, I was thinking about how I'd love to read a mad scene in fantasy, because I used to watch a lot of operas, and one trope that's very common in opera, or it seems a little common in opera, at least I know of 3 of them, is a mad scene. And I actually started a project of trying to draw certain mad scenes in opera. This is basically when the female protagonist has this huge section at the end of the opera where she goes absolutely crazy. And I'm not saying that this mad scene originates in opera. I'm sure it originates way before then. but it is common. It is a trope in opera, and I've never seen it in fantasy. And I always thought it would be interesting to see that happen in fantasy. And wow, did I get it with Sandalap. Really, really tragic though, just to see what happened with her. Then with what happened on the first shore, very incredible. Like the imagery there, especially with the sheik and the Tistandi, especially when they kneel before Yedan, who dies, and Jan Tobis going over to her brother's body, and how Yedan talks about how he's coming home or has some sort of sense of returning home when he dies. There were so many beautiful and bittersweet and powerful, incredible cinematic moments with the first shore scenes, and had a huge payoff in my opinion. Now back to the Malazans. I was so surprised with Blistic and the scene in which Tavor confronts Blistic and tells him that she saved his life 3 to 4 times. And it's just amazing to learn about Tavor in this book, how she was basically a military prodigy. She studied her history, that she studied what moves to make. She knew what she was doing. And it seems like her leadership skills really come to the forefront in this book. So much of what we haven't seen of Tavor's ability to lead really shows through in this book. And I think one of those decisions is shown in how she deals with Blistic. And she very well could have killed him, as he was a huge threat to her. And she didn't. She put him in charge of the center formation. And I thought that was amazing that she took that risk. She obviously knew it was a risk. It paid off. And she also put Kindly in charge of another formation, and Ferret Sort in charge of another one. And I loved that because I think it's fascinating to take into consideration these particular Malazan leaders and how Ferret Sort, she stepped on Joyful Union. She really helped in Yucatan, and by going against Tavor's orders, and later on really took on a motherly role towards Beak. So I think that Ferret Sort kind of does her own thing in a way, and she pays off as far as leadership. Same with Kindly. Kindly's a pretty strong force. He doesn't really live up to the word kindly, but what a strong leader. And he also comes to the forefront there too. And obviously he puts his foot down with Blistic as far as when Blistic stabs Pores. Another thing to mention is Fiddler and Hedge. So with Fiddler and Hedge's relationship, I thought it was beautiful. I know that Fiddler has been pushing away Hedge for a while now, and we find out that it's mostly because he doesn't want to have to go through the pain of losing him again. And I think it's so understandable. And of course, Hedge says that he had no choice but to resurrect. It wasn't really up to him. And there was a scene in which I believe Fiddler jumps on Hedge to, move him out of the way to save him. And it reminded me very much of a scene in House of Chains when Hedge does the same for Fiddler. And in this particular scene, there's some sort of fictitious character that comes along named Nefarious Bread. But there is some interesting conversation about soldiers. And of course, there's a lot of talk in this book about soldiers being found family and being bonded by the blood lost between soldiers. And there's just an understanding between soldiers. I really loved the coin of respect discussion that was had about why it's not easy to give or receive that coin of respect, and how Hedge urges Fiddler to take that coin back, or you got to give that coin back when it comes to having the soldiers, asking of soldiers for more time. So I really enjoyed that. I think it spoke to survivor's guilt, the way that soldiers honor each other, honor those fallen among them, going back to the fallen idea. And I think it's also meaningful because even with all of that, we understand that soldiers understand, there's this understanding amongst soldiers that what they do matters not only for themselves, but for everyone, for all the other soldiers. So it's like every step becomes very, very meaningful when you're a soldier. And of course, in a fantasy book, of course, you know that there are even greater repercussions to what actions soldiers take or anybody takes. But in this particular book, it's the unwitnessed part. They're going to do this and may never be known again. Again, that history may never even remember them. So I found the universality theme with the soldiers too, just really powerful. I loved that relationship between those two. I also loved the relationship and found it so sad when Stormy and Gessler died at the Spire. such a tragic scene when Sin goes crazy and that Stormy ends up going down with her and having to take her down basically and has to die in the process. And then, of course, when Gessler dies, saving Bent. And what an honorable thing to do for Bent. It just breaks your heart. Powerful soldier moments. Again, the other one would be probably when Tok joins Iskar Jarek and becomes a bridge burner. I just want to mention that one really quickly. And now also I'm going to go ahead and mention, of course, Tavor and Paran's reunion, which was so heartbreaking when she said, I lost her. Just so many powerful, tearful moments throughout the end of this book. And then a moment of laughter when Hedge and Fiddler are with so few left, and it seems like their odds are against them. And I think it's Fiddler who asks, who are we doing this for? And the answer is everyone. And then out of nowhere, the one starts laughing, they all start laughing. And you just can't help but feel that connection there. And I think that one thing I'll say about all the soldiers, all the characters in this book, of course, they don't all die, but it was very powerful to see the moments when they were in their last moments, either fighting or dying, and just considering where they'd come from was a very meaningful thing for me, because just following these characters for so long and seeing where they started, it just brought back so many interesting memories. It just brought a whole different emotional experience for me, just feeling like I'm the one witnessing all of this happening, I guess, feeling like I'm the witness in a way. Other things I haven't really gone into detail about are the deaths of Kilmandaros and Knuckles by the hands of Draconis. Of course, the reunion between Tool and Hetan and their children, which was lovely. And all the stuff with Corvallis, if I'm saying that right, and the whole storm and everything. There's a lot that happened in this book that I'm probably not going to go into detail about. I'm sorry if I'm not. Of course, the epilogues were just beautiful. I especially loved Corlat's, her section with the stone and how she was about to give up Whiskey Jack's stone. And Fiddler let her know that Whiskey Jack loves her, still loves her, and waits for her. And what a beautiful, beautiful scene. And I also absolutely loved the reunion between Apsalar and Crocus. It was such a beautiful ending in so many ways. There were so many beautiful romantic relationships, like with Bryce and Enerict. Also beautiful interaction there. Herb and Hellion. I'm probably forgetting a few others, but I just really love the relationships in Malazan. Obviously, they're all so, so beautiful. And one thing to mention is that I loved seeing Tavor's arc throughout this book, throughout this series. And even though we see her come forward and show her vulnerability more, with the stabbing scene, drawing blood. And I cannot believe that scene, by the way, because of course I remember the scene when Mael gives her the dagger. And I don't know why it just didn't click for me until that moment of need. Of course, it's like I should have seen that coming a mile away and I totally forgot. It was just brilliant. It was just beautiful. One thing I'll say about Tavor, though, is it was just interesting to see how she, even though she sort of opens up and you see her vulnerability so much more in certain moments throughout the book, there's still sort of an isolation there still. She still seems like a loner, even at the very end, which was very consistent for her. But I just love that character. I wanted to jump in this book so many times and hug Tavor. Before I forget to mention this, I should also say that Tahol's letter was the funniest thing I've ever read. I thought it was so hilarious. And I also want to talk about Karsa, because Karsa didn't have a lot of page time, but the page time he did have with consoling the crippled man was beautiful. Munuk, I think, was the name of the man. And I believe he showed up in previous books. I did cheat and look at Wiki for that, but I was really impressed with those passages, especially as he really reflects on compassion and love and how civilization is not necessarily conducive towards cultivating compassion. But I just think that the whole entire theme of compassion, the theme of empathy, and the whole idea of freeing the crippled god, of saving the crippled god or sending him home, I think it's really interesting because one thing that comes to my mind whenever I think of compassion is this interview I read with Thich Nhat Hanh. If you don't know who Thich Nhat Hanh is, he's a Buddhist monk, a Vietnamese Buddhist monk. And I've read some of his works years ago. I used to own a couple of his books. And I'm not a Buddhist myself, but I really respect his writing and his teachings. And one thing that he said about compassion that has always stayed with me is that there is no compassion without understanding. And I'll go ahead and read a passage that I found where he kind of explains this. He says, forgiveness will not be possible until compassion is born in our heart. Even if you want to forgive, you cannot forgive. In order to be compassionate, you have to understand why the other person has done that to you and your people. You have to see that they are victims of their own confusion, their own worldview, their own grieving, their own discrimination, their own lack of understanding and compassion. Quick note here, although this quote is about forgiveness as it relates to compassion and understanding, I am mostly focused on the compassion part as it relates to Malazan Book of the Fallen. I know there is a lot more that can be explored on this topic, and I would be happy to extend the discussion further in the comments or in future videos if there is any interest. I also want to be clear that I don't think Thich Nhat Hanh or any part of the Malazan series is suggesting that offering compassion is the same as condoning destructive behaviors. I want to make sure that distinction is known because I think it is very important. So I think that, again, that speaks to the concept of empathy. And of course, he has things to say about empathy, even if he doesn't use the word empathy, but being able to see from the other person's perspective. And I think that this book does, or this series does, a brilliant job of showing you so many different perspectives. And once you think you understand or know something, seeing a broader context and relating a universal theme to that. And I think, again, that universality is an important part of it. Not all of us are going to know exactly what it's like to endure a specific kind of trauma, but we can understand our universal experience with pain and suffering. The other thing that I find fascinating about this theme of empathy and the theme of compassion is that before I even read this book, I had been reflecting on the concept of empathy and how it's very easy to offer empathy to somebody who is vulnerable and open and shows their wounds, but it is very difficult to extend empathy to someone you don't know anything about, you have no understanding of, that you can't see. And the same thing with compassion. It's very easy to offer compassion, to extend compassion to somebody who shows compassion, who shows a capacity for compassion. It's very difficult to offer compassion to somebody who seems to lack compassion. And I think, again, this series does a brilliant job of just showing you what's possible in the human heart, and especially this whole mission to free the crippled God, because the crippled God doesn't seem like somebody who has a great deal of compassion and empathy, but the choice to do it anyway, especially coming from Tavor. Tavor seems like very cold iron. She seems like she's not a very feeling person. She's not a very open person. And so it's hard to see and relate through her eyes. But her ability to do that and to show that she can do that shows us something. And so that's something I find very powerful in this series. And another part about all of that is related to introspection too, because it takes me back to that quote in the Bone Hunters with Bottle when they're in Igatan. Compassion existed when and only when one could step outside oneself to see the bars from inside the cage. And I don't know if I understand this quote 100%, but my experience with my own journey towards self-compassion and therefore extending compassion to others is that I know that for me, having a little bit of distance from whatever pain I'm feeling, being able to see it, to witness it in myself, has given me the capacity to have a gentle softness around whatever challenging thing is coming up for me. And in being able to do that, it has helped me have the capacity to extend that to others much, much more easily than it was before, when I had no distance from whatever pain I was feeling. It would be, the identification would be, I am sad or I am hurt, instead of I feel sad or I feel hurt, and having a little bit of distance. So I feel like this series has a lot to say, again, about introspection. these are just some of my general thoughts on the topic. I'm not an expert. I'm not perfect at compassion or empathy by any means. So I hope I don't come across that way in this video. Just relating through my own experience, especially as these are major themes in the series. And I'd love to talk about these topics more with anybody who's interested. So this series has obviously been very, very meaningful for me in multiple ways, and I have thoroughly enjoyed my time reading it. There were a lot of things, obviously, I didn't talk about. There are a lot of things in the story that I feel like I still am trying to understand. I have been informed that another way of looking at this series is that it is narrated from the crippled god's perspective. I had to be told that from a certain Dr. Fantasy. I wouldn't have picked that up on my own, but I'm sure rereading the series with that in mind will be all the more illuminating. And I just look forward to rereading this someday. I don't know that it'll happen right away, and I probably need to go ahead and read some other books in the Malazan world between now and then. But it's been a very meaningful journey for me, and one I'm excited to talk about more. I will plan to have some discussion videos on this series and hope to meet with other booktubers possibly on other channels to talk about spoilers, because my thoughts, there are more thoughts I have. I have a lot of thoughts, but I really think that this series, it really did live up to my expectations, honestly. It really did. I think it really stuck to landing, even though I didn't understand every detail. I really enjoyed my experience, and I'm really looking forward to not only participating in other discussions on this book, but also watching other discussions and learning from other people who understood maybe a bit more than I did. So if you made it this far in the video, again, I'm sorry if I didn't cover your favorite moment or talk about everything that this book had to offer, because there's so much. But I hope that you did enjoy what I did share, and please let me know in the comments your thoughts on anything I shared in this video. I also want to thank you again if you're watching this video, because chances are I'm probably not going to get a ton of views for a spoiler-filled talk in a 10-book series on the final book. But please let me know your thoughts again in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.